morning and welcome to Sunrise Daily. I'm Ayo Makinde.
Well, it's also a beautiful Wednesday morning.
Yep.
You're welcome to Sunrise Daily. Well, I mean, there are three...
Who am I sitting with?
Oh, I'm Kayode Okikio.
Just wanted to be sure.
But, that's by the way. But, government is important. I mean, we can't overemphasize that. But, when we talk about government, a lot of times people focus on the executive, which is understandable. In the kind of system we operate, power is usually, constricted at that area. But don't forget, there's the executive, there's the legislature, and the judiciary, which are meant to be checks and balances for each other, such that one is not powerful or overbearing on the other. So there can always be checks and balances. That's the idea. But, over time in Nigeria, it's not really been the ideal. The reality has been different from the ideal. But then you take a look at, yes, the executive, there are a lot of issues there. But the legislature also, you wonder, just how much of representation do Nigerians have? How much of quality representation do Nigerians have? And most times we talk about legislature, yet again, we look at the federal level. We look at the National Assembly, that's the House of Representatives, and the Senate. But don't forget that we have state assemblies across the 36 states of the Federation. If you ask me, I'll tell you that a lot of Nigerians barely know their state assembly representatives, talk more of their federal representatives. And that's a huge concern, because a lot of the issues we have should actually be sorted in those areas. If you don't put pressure on the state assemblies, if you don't put pressure on the federal assemblies, then you probably won't get as much result. So this is an awakening call, especially because yesterday you find out that in Gombe, there was an impeachment. In Ondo State, there was an impeachment also of the deputy speaker. And this is not the first time we've had impeachments. Just this year alone, we've had several impeachments and near fights, across the state assemblies. And you wonder, so that means there's really something in these state assemblies that we have impeachments, but still you have little or no engagement coming from the people. So is this a wake-up call? Because the impeachments we're having means that something is really going down there, because why would there be a jostle for positions in the first place if nothing is at stake? So I think this is a wake-up call, not just for the people of Gombe State, not just for the people of Ondo State, for Nigerians generally. Begin to ask questions. You can actually visit during plenary. Do you know that? You can be a part of plenary. Just know what's happening at those state assemblies, not just impeachment, and that's all we get to hear about state assemblies. No, it is beyond that. And I think this morning, as you're waking up to go to work, this should be a wake-up call for you as a Nigerian to get involved at the state level and, of course, at the federal level too.
Well, getting involved will probably begin with getting interested, so that people will know what the functions of the state houses of assembly are. Really, as far as the Constitution is concerned, there is nothing the executive should be able to do without the State House of Assembly or the National Assembly at that. Most of the time, as Kayode mentioned, when we talk about government, we talk about the federal level, we talk about the National Assembly, we talk about the senators and their jumbo pay, House of Representatives members and their jumbo pay, but then we do not give attention to the fact that it is the State Houses of Assembly that pass the laws. These are the people that pass the laws that they execute anyway, whether you know about it or not. You have heard us talk on this program about a number of things, one of which is the pension law for governors and deputy governors. And these laws were passed by members of the State House of Assembly in your state. And they do a lot of work. They are supposed to oversight, they're supposed to ensure that things are done as and when by the state governments. But most of the time when we also talk about these issues, we forget the fact that we have representation in all of these areas. Theirs is not to provide anything for you. Theirs is to ensure that the government, the state government, provides anything for you. So going to your House of Assembly member to say you need a borehole and you need all those things, those really aren't their functions. Their function is to ensure that the governor and the ministries, departments, and agencies in those states they do what they're expected to do. Now, coming to the issue of this, the impeachments, impeachment of the Speaker in Gombe, impeachment of the Deputy Speaker in Ondo State, then you begin to wonder what interests are at play. It's not the first time in Nigeria that this is happening. It's happening it happened in a number of states, in all the 6 geopolitical zones that we have. The question that you want to ask is, what are the interests here? A number of people continue to say it is because the governor is so powerful and consequently he is making some impact, he is influencing the decisions. Maybe, maybe not. But then there is a good number of people in the House of Assembly. And the people, there are those who also believe that you can't be a member of the House of Assembly without, being in good partnership or being in a good relationship with the state governor, and same, for members of the National Assembly. Maybe, maybe not. But then what value do you bring to the table? These are the things that are at play. I know that the big word, most of the time when we talk politics, is interests. Whose interest is being played out? Is it that of the politician, that of the government official, or that of the people that they are supposed to be governing? Please get interested, because the more interested you are, the more involved you want to be, and the better a state you would want to have. We're back after now for the papers. To stay with us. Our first pick this morning, South-South leaders give FG 7-point demand. That's the lead of the Nigerian Tribune this morning. You remember that meeting that was supposed to hold that didn't hold well. Finally, it held, and the story is on page 5. Reinforce restructuring and true federalism, relocation of headquarters of major oil firms to the South-South, NDDC projects executed in conjunction with state governments. Well, more of that you'll find definitely on page 5. When we had that conversation with the governor of Rivers State, I was wondering, what role do state governments have to play in the functions of the NDDC? Otherwise, if the NDDC is supposed to be for development of the South-South states, why should the state governments be struggling with road infrastructure, for instance?
Which is the irony of the system, the type of federalism that we operate. I mean, you would expect that the state would have a huge role
Absolutely.
to play. But as it stands, it's a federal agency, as it were. So, I mean, it comes from the top.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's a federal agency and it is supposed to be playing some significant role, I mean, why should the roads of Asaba be the way they are? Should it be the business or the problem of the government of Edo State to handle or take care of the roads in Benin City, in Rivers? I understand that many roads and flyovers are coming up in Rivers State now that are just that of the state government, and a number of other states like that in the South. So maybe we want to find out what exactly is going on there.
Oh yeah, but I believe that there's interface definitely between the agency and the people from time to time, but it's the quality of that interface.
Well, maybe
that is the
because
challenge.
you remember when we asked the governor of, Governor Wike, he was saying it was neither here nor there. On this, it's not really such a strong relationship. Maybe it's the quality of the relationship that you're talking about.
That's a huge challenge then.
Anyway, that's what you have on the lead of the Nigerian Tribune this morning. So many other stories you'll find right on the front page. 1 injured police post burnt as Okada riders prison warders clash in Ibadan. This is something that, pretty much took Twitter agog yesterday, when a number of people were saying, just whatever, any small infraction, and then people, touch up a police station. What exactly is going on? Anyway, that's right there on the front page, and you definitely want to pick it up. Above the nameplate, NSARS, Senate recommends 1% VAT for Lagos, Edo, other affected states. You find that on page 5 of the Nigerian Tribune today. On the back page is sports. Real join Chukwueze chase. Well, that's what you have right there. I guess definitely making some money, right?
Really? He's building his career. Let's start from that one.
Really?
Yeah.
I see. All right. That's a tribute this morning.
Next up is the Vanguard newspaper, and the lead story: selfish northerners opposing restructuring, says El Rufai. discloses why APC stepped down restructuring bill in 2018. Says APC is still committed to restructuring. You'll understand why, because his name comes up a lot, especially with that white paper. So is this a response? Well, take a look at more riders. Notes opposition elements don't represent North. Advocates for state police, state judicial autonomy. It's game to hoodwink the unwary. That's coming from Afenifere. It's all part of APC's lies to Nigerians, or Aneze. APC government not honest with Nigerians. Pandef. So you have those positions clearly stated there. There's no, hiding words there. These are the positions of these different groups. And of course, the governor of Kaduna State says he's speaking for the North. So how will there be a consensus? Will there ever be a consensus? Well, page 5 should give more light to that story. And the big picture, of course, shows the FG South-South stakeholders meeting, which finally held. And, of course, the outcome of it, you'd see in the pages. You see this one, 30% levy cut on imported vehicles will spell doom. Local assemblers warn. It's on page 31. So it's quite of a tricky slope here. So some say, what do we have a comparative advantage in? Should we go into assembling vehicles? Is that really something we can flourish in? Especially because if you look at other countries who are doing this, I mean, they have gone miles ahead in assembling. But we're just starting. So is this something we should be doing now, or just focus on other things?
We didn't just start, Kayode.
We're just restarting. Clearly, we dropped the ball.
Yes, we did drop the ball. And I remember I saw a video very, very recently of the head of state at the time, General Gowon, opening, was it the Peugeot plant in Kaduna or the Volkswagen plant in Lagos? I think it was in the 70s. Of course, it was in the 70s, early 70s. He was declaring the plant open and even drove one of those vehicles at the time. That was as far back as that time. So we had the Peugeot plant in Kaduna. We had the Volkswagen plant in Lagos. We had a Namco in, we had Leyland in Ibadan. We had a Namco somewhere in the east. I think it was Anambra. And a number of other places like that. So we have had it over time, and it created an enormous number of jobs, millions of jobs for people. Of course, Kayode, the value chain of a vehicle, of assembling a vehicle in Nigeria. What the value chain is. So how many can we really boast of now? So we should really go. And then, come on, for God's sake, we have the Ajaokuta steel rolling mill coming. And then there's, we remember our guest telling us yesterday of a steel plant in the east. So we have everything it takes to have a car manufacturing.
Not even just assembly, because that's what we have mostly now.
Exactly.
But how competitive would those cars be in Africa, for example? There's AFTA coming up. So how competitive will those cars be, not just in Africa, maybe globally? Now that, don't forget, companies are saying they're jettisoning cars that use fossil fuels.
If we had sustained the efforts we were making at the time, I think it was even under the, I'm not sure right now whether it was under the Babangida government or the Obasanjo government at the time, we had, they assembled or built a car called Prada, or something like that, and it was new, it was unique. Okay, yeah, we Nigeria has made a car and all, and was thinking, okay, maybe from this one we'll grow into something else, and then everything just went comatose. So it's a whole value chain that we will build for ourselves if we will even go into it. How competitive we'll be, I guess it's in the start. But remember what happened. Beg your pardon. Remember what happened when we had Nigeria Airways, and 20 years after we couldn't find just one aircraft. So,
maybe the silver lining is the government saying that, we should patronize, at least the government would patronize local manufacturers, of which I don't even like that term. Nigerian manufacturers, right? What's local manufacturers? Well, you get the point. Sports page, Raw survives. That's the lead for sports this morning. Minister soft pedals on sack. Raw to get psychologist, nutritionist for Eagles. So begs the question, does that mean we never had a psychologist or a nutritionist in the team? To accommodate home-based players, NFF promises to beef up technical crew. So, that will be the vanguard for you this morning.
The Daily Trust newspaper leads with APC zoning agreement should be respected in 2023. Ascribed to Fashola, the Minister of Works and Housing, says we must deliver on our promises to retain power. There was a deal to shift power to Southwest after Buhari chieftain. We'll cross the bridge when we get there. Official. The page 5 of the paper this morning has the story.
That's where the bridge is. And check that bridge on page 5. See how it is crossed.
And there's this one interesting. That picture is actually quite interesting. You're wondering what it's about? Well, it's that of some residents in Plateau who looted items from warehouses during the EndSARS crisis, returned them to the new government house, and beg owners for forgiveness. That's on the front page right there of the Daily Trust newspaper this morning. Right under that one, you find WTO coast clear for Okonjo-Iweala as Korean candidate drops. Stories on page 34. Does that mean that it's an automatic ticket now?
Well, good news, I believe. We're waiting to see how that plays out, right?
Okay. Well, so many other stories. We'll leave you to choose your pick on the front page of the Daily Trust today.
Well, Nigerian News Direct is next. South governors demand privatization of refineries, restructuring. That term is not going away anytime soon. More details on page 2. And you see the picture on the front page that shows the commissioning, I believe, of the 5,000 barrels per day modular refinery. So if you do the math, 5,000 barrels per day, how much of petrol would we get from that? Significant? Well, it's a good step forward. Don't forget that I think the capacity is meant to be 45,000 barrels per day. So it's a good step forward.
Well, while that is something that we might want to live with and dance with, don't also forget that there are talks about these modular refineries. Are we making any move in that direction at all? Because if the talk about subsidy is going to be a thing of the past, something of history, that has to be a place where we'll go. The Guardian newspaper this morning leads with this one. Naira weakens badly. Doesn't sound like good news, but that's what you have on the front page. As MPC retains policy rate and other parameters, food inflation to moderate as harvest starts, says Emefiele. We must avoid blind speculation, Adedipe warns. That story continues on page 2 from the front page. And right under that picture, right under that story, beside the pictures you see, Nigerian doctor in Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine trial speaks. NMA, NCDC, others hail Ubago. Nigerians are gifted people, says ex-Transcorp chief Ozigbo. Find that on the front page. The story continues on page 2. And a number of other stories. South demands restructuring, fiscal federalism. Nigeria not part of Visa Bond pilot scheme. US clarifies. Thankful for that. The story is on page 3. That's the Guardian today.
Well, next up is Daily Independent, and this concerns the economy, which of course means it concerns you. Experts disagree with FG on quick exit from recession. Don't forget, the Minister of Finance did say, well, we're going to get out of this quick enough, record time.
Yeah, there are still people who are saying, are you sure of that?
Well, so those are the experts, I believe. And then you see the rider, Nigeria's recovery hampered by OPEC production cuts. So clearly with production cuts means that we, of course, aren't going to be earning as much revenue as we would have loved to from our major revenue earner, which is oil. I know Nigeria did present some proposals to OPEC Plus saying, well, this is our peculiar case and this is how we need it to go. But because you belong to a group, you need to abide by the rules of that group, especially because you're not the only one who will be affected. This will probably affect. But, you know, a lot of questions really about this, how sustainable this will be. I mean, that's one of the reasons you had Brexit, for example, because Britain thought, well, these are the things we want for ourselves and we don't think we can get that in this association. So how about we just step aside? Yes, geographically we're still part of that association, but in terms of those terms and agreements, well, we're not exactly part of it, but maybe that's a topic for another day. That story starts on the front page, continues on page 4. So what does that mean for you? Maybe you find more details right there. I see Senate okays Buhari's request to refund 148.14 billion naira to 5 states. It's on page 2. You know, when you see those amounts, you don't hear the backstory, what the states will have to go through just to get that, you know, getting promissory notes and what have you. And it might not eventually get down to this particular figure.
What will be removed? Okay, you mean the taxes and levies?
They'll have to negotiate with banks, as it were, and, you know, of course.
Don't also forget don't also forget that some of those states, you know, they took a loan from the government, some kind of bailout at some point.
Which the government has been deducting, right?
Which deducted has been, okay, so that's perhaps part of what you're talking about here now?
Well, you know, some of them constructed roads with the state's money. They will say with our money or with their money, but with the state's money. So I guess this is part of it. But you know what? It's on page 2 of a Daily Independent. But you know, the governor of the CBN had some strong words yesterday, which is this one right on top of the nameplate, saying parallel market can't decide Naira rate. Emefiele. Analysts not surprised as MPC retains MPR at 11.5%. Some were thinking maybe it will go lower because we're in a recession, but that's what you have. And this interesting one, Senate seeks 1% VAT reward for states affected by End SARS violence. It's on page 4. So,
and that is one of the recommendations made on the floor of the Senate yesterday. One other representation that was made there was that attention should also be given not just to what the youths have said, but to the youths themselves. One of the senators, I think it was the former deputy Senate president, was saying that we don't seem to be giving enough attention to the youths, not giving enough attention to their needs and their peculiarities, and that the earlier we did that, the better for us in the long run.
Oh yes, which is why one of the slogans of that protest was "Speak louder." Of course, it was in Yoruba, but that's a translation in English. And the final note, that story that explains what the big picture is about. South-South governors, leaders demand restructuring and MPC subsidiaries relocation. Don't forget, the federal government representatives were at that meeting with the South-South governor, the same way they were at the meeting with Southwest governors and the Northern governors also. So you expect that these recommendations will be taken back, and of course, we'll get some form of action.
Everyone is talking about restructuring now. Is this the time for it?
Well, some would say last week was the time for it, but, well, this now is the second best time, so.
All right, that's the papers this morning. We're back in a moment for more of the issues for the day. Just stay with us. Well, so many things to talk about as far as the recession in Nigeria is concerned. This is not the first time we're in a recession, but we're in one now, twice within the past 4 or 5 years or thereabout. And what does this spell for us? And where do we go from here? How do we ensure that this doesn't happen again anytime soon? We have 3 gentlemen joining us for this conversation this morning. Emmanuel Apollo, an economic researcher, risk management professional, and DG, the Economic Think Tank Center Limited, is here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, we have the former chairman of Nigeria Economic Summit Group, Buka Kyari, who joins us via Zoom. Thank you so much for your time. As well as the DG Budget Office for the Federation, Mr. Ben Akabuze. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Well, let me begin with you, Mr. Apollo. So this is where we are now. One of the things that the people on the panel of the event that we played just before now, the 6th Economic Summit Group, just said is that we need to listen to the people. From where you stand, from feelers that you may have gotten, what do you think the people are saying? How do you think people are taking this recession on board?
Well, we can categorize the group, the people into 2 groups. Those who have information about what is happening, and those who do not have such information, but they're just seeing the impact. They're just seeing what is happening to the economy. Now, for those who are informed, we would say that that category of people already know that this is going to happen, that there's going to be recession, And so it has not come to them as a surprise. Because if you watch the macroeconomic indicators in the past couple of months, and with the global pandemic, the total lockdown, and the shutdown of the global supply chain, and of course the NSAS, it was just a matter of time that we're going to get into a recession. Even many informed Nigerians had even predicted that the fall in aggregate demand, that is the decline in GDP growth, was going to be in the region of about 6% negative growth. And now we have minus 3.6%, which some are even celebrating. That was even wonderful. So for this category of people, they are aware that there was going to be a recession, so it has not come to them as a surprise. Now, the other category that is not informed, and they begin to see the various challenges and discontinuities in the system and total collapse of the system, they are beginning to see the impact in terms of their disposable income, in terms of their social status, the level of savings, the level of investments, closure of companies, and so on. So it has been a disaster for this category of people. And so we will say that we take it from that level to say that it has been very, very disastrous for so many people. Many businesses have closed down, and many are not happy with government.
Some of them, another category of people, are those that ask or wonder how we can have 2 recessions in just a space of 4 or 5 years. And they wonder, is it just happenstance, just circumstances, or there's something we're not getting right in terms of economic management of the country?
Perfect. There's a lot we're not getting right in terms of economic management. Remember, during the time of Obasanjo, during the time of Jonathan, you find that those who were managing the economy were not necessarily politicians. They didn't belong to any political party. We have one country, and that is Nigeria. Once you have won an election, we have a country to run, okay? And so they brought in Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, they brought in Professor Soludo. They assembled all the best, the eggheads in the system. We even had a coordinating minister for the economy. Because the kind of system you are running now is disaggregated. You see, there's a lot of knee-jerk everywhere because there's no coordination. You have monetary policy in one direction, you have fiscal policy in another direction, you have income policy. So yes, we have documents, sustainability, economic plan, and so on. But the point is there is no coordination. And that is why the economy is in shambles. That's why we are where we are. So I agree with you that economic management has been in shambles. That is why we'll keep on getting this recession. It has nothing to do with some are making the argument, because of pandemic. The next thing, because of NSAS, because. Many countries also have this problem. So economic management has been a major issue, and we need to sort that out.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kyari, do you agree with him on the fact that management of economy, the way we have managed the economy, is contributory significantly to how come we're in a recession despite the pandemic?
It is a possible cause. I mean, it's one of the factors that is putting us into this situation. Now, remember, it is actually 4 years, because the recession that we went into previously was in the middle of 2016. Now, it's just about 4 years and 1 quarter or thereabouts. Now, here is something for us to think about. One, before the decline in GDP growth in Q2, if you look at the previous 10 quarters, our GDP growth rate per quarter was at 1.5% to 2.55%, which means in the last 2.5 years prior to going into this negative growth rate, we were growing at an abysmally anemic rate. Our population growth was around 2.6, 2.7% per year, which means that, even though you we were as a nation not in a technical recession. Since the last recession, we have been growing at an abysmal GDP growth rate, which basically means that jobs were being lost, all kinds of issues were going on. We were actually in a pandemic situation before the pandemic. That's how, so let's actually focus on that. The major factor had been oil price decline when you are an economy that depends on a single product for your livelihood. Now, the second, of course, is that with the monetary policy shifts that were going on, some were experimental, some unorthodox. I had even mentioned in previous occasions that what the central bank governor was doing were quite unorthodox, and I don't believe it would work. There was a very short moment when it really worked, but so far it has been completely, knee-jerk, as the gentleman previously mentioned, and so that now compounded the situation. So in addition to, so let's even put aside the COVID-19. So even prior to COVID-19, we were in a terrible situation. Two, the exchange, there was a liquidity constraint as a result of the restrictions and of movement and so on and so forth that basically added to that negative 6.1% GDP growth in Q2, and then the subsequent one, which is the last quarter, which was 3.6% or thereabouts negative. Now, those are not a pretty situation for any nation in the world, let alone a nation of nearly 200 million people. And so we need to do something to boost growth, but that I can leave it for some other time. Inflation from January to date had gone up from 12% to approximately 14.5%. Now, even if we were having positive GDP growth, with the job losses and inflation rate, the average person will feel like it is a recession for them, but let alone when the economists come out and tell us that we are in a technical recession. So essentially, the situation is not pretty for us, economy-wise speaking. And then we may need to have to prescribe some measures. The boundary closure and all of those are all things that factor in. The only shining segment of the economy was ICT. Now, ICT doesn't require any government manipulations. ICT is what I would call a creative and innovative sector of the economy, and to a certain extent, even entertainment, because you don't need any special government intervention for it to work. All you need to do is investors need to look at it as an opportunity that they can put their money in, and they can get better returns. Now, the situation that we're faced with today as a nation requires some hard thinking and hard work from our government agents. Thank you.
Let me take this now to Mr. Kabweze. Now, a good number of issues have been raised, but maybe we'll bring them down to just three here. Well, there is that talk that we've had a knee-jerk reaction as far as the economy is concerned. Everything just seems to be responding to things on the go. Perhaps you want to respond to that. Added to that is the issue of inflation that's just been mentioned by Mr. Kyari, as well as the fact that we haven't really been growing at the kind of speed that we ought to grow. We were, walking, so to speak, on the brink of a recession even before the pandemic hit. How do you respond to these issues?
Well, thank you. I think that, on the surface, those would appear to be valid observations. But, let me begin with the question of whether the reaction has been knee-jerk. I think that, that's not a fair characterization of the effort that has been put in. Of course, not surprisingly, ultimately it's results that people, if you deliver results without effort, you'll be hailed, despite how much effort, if the results don't show, it will look like there's none. But to underscore the point that this is not simply knee-jerk, let me read from the president's budget speech. When the president presented the 2021 budget speech, he said, and I quote, "GDP growth is projected to be negative in the third quarter of this year. As such, our economy may lapse into the second recession in 4 years with significant adverse consequences. However, we are working assiduously to ensure a rapid recovery in 2021. Okay? So, the economy lapsing into recession, it didn't take us by surprise. We had seen that and the measures taken. And the honest truth is that without those, countervailing measures, the decline would have been steeper than what we currently have. Okay, so it's not correct to say people just being just knee-jerk reactions to the situation. The fact of the matter is that the global economy is currently in recession. There's hardly any economy in the world that is not currently in recession as a consequence of COVID-19. For us, unfortunately, we were caught by this just at the point of recovery. We exited recession mid-2017 and entered a phase of recovery, which was, subsequently to recover and then to grow. There were deliberate choices made by the current administration, which is its approach to driving growth. We have seen periods in this country where we had high growth, but the growth was not inclusive. And so side by side with high economic growth, poverty was also growing. This government is trying to work on a reset to have growth and inclusiveness together. Unfortunately, that has meant that the pace of growth is slower than, if you were just, single-mindedly focused on driving, growth. That's, basically, the fact of the situation. There was the other point that you made, which just escaped me now as I was addressing this. Can you remind me?
Yeah, he's also talked about the abysmal growth, the fact that over the years, the growth rate has been very, very low. We were down 6 point something.
I said...
Yeah. Yes, go on.
That's what I just spoke to. I said we exited recession and entered a recovery phase.
Okay.
And so the growth was, picking up. You will note that, quarter on quarter, the growth was picking up. It was low. It was admittedly below population growth. And for as long as that was the case, for the majority of the people, they may not have felt the growth. But I said it was, a policy choice that the government of the day made to drive growth and inclusiveness at the same time, rather than a single-minded pursuit of growth, that you might achieve high growth without, inclusiveness, without carrying everyone along.
No, I think the third one, which you were referring to, concerns inflation. The fact that, inflation is on the rise. We're reaching a point where we'll get to a record rise of inflation in the country. So that's the third one, the third point which you wanted to respond to. So if you can do that briefly so we can expand the conversation.
Well, yes, inflation has been on the rise. Don't forget that, inflation got as high as 18%, and then we had 12 successive periods of inflation declining, and then it started picking up again. And then when you look at the so we're still significantly below the peak that we reached over the last 4 years. But at over 14%, inflation is worrisome. And of course, when you then have inflation side by side with negative GDP growth, that makes it even more worrisome. But when you look at this inflation, when you unpack it, you will see that the component of food, inflation is really, that's the key, the key driver of this inflation. And so essentially our work is cut out for us. We need to, basically drive, growth in that sector. Fortunately, the agriculture sector, continues to grow, albeit at currently lower. Even in Q3, it grew by about 1.4%, which is really low by the standards of performance that we've seen from that sector. So we need to focus on that. We need to address all of the bottlenecks in the sector that make it difficult for produce to get to the market, and minimize the harvest losses and all of that. I mean, some people have argued that, and that is true. It's a policy choice that government that to make.
Right.
Closing the borders.
We'll come into some of those.
Contributor to driving up food inflation, because there's a lot of import of food coming to but it was a deliberate choice by government to do that and try and shore up domestic production. And oftentimes you have trade-offs when you make policy choices, and sometimes you need to trade off inflation for growth.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kabweze, we would like to expand this also. We'll come into some of the issues you've raised, especially looking at the ERGP, the ESP, the projections and what we have and what we're getting into, especially because the government says this is going to be quick exiting this recession. But let's come to our Lagos studio. Mr. Bolo, you've seen some of the reactions, responses, let me use that term, from the government. Just yesterday we had the MPR decision. It was kept at 11.5. I mean, some will say that in a recession, maybe the interest rates should go much lower, such that you can have more money available for people to borrow. We understand that if it was left to people would increase the interest rates, but the government steps in. So they expected this should have dropped. So in terms of the MPR and other responses you have seen from government, how do you rate them in getting us out of this recession?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Ultimately, the efforts of government, the efforts of anybody is summarized, in what comes out in your macroeconomic indicators. We don't reward efforts. We are doing this, we are doing that. Everything is summarized in the GDP. The GDP is negative. Then you look at another indicator, inflation is going to 16%. So while you will say we are doing this, we are making efforts, we are making this, we are making that, you summarize everything. The GDP is a summary of everything. You talked about inclusive growth. That is even another layer. Let's not even go to issue of inclusive growth. For me, it is quite abstract and theoretical. Inclusive growth. GDP is negative. Now we have a unique situation. That is what he tried to paint. You have hyperinflation. At the same time, you have negative GDP growth. So that the viewers understand what we are talking about. When you say negative GDP growth, that's recession. What are we really talking about? Do we understand what that means? Negative GDP growth, and that is recession. It is simply, a decline in your aggregate demand. This is pure economics. Decline in aggregate demand, and in a state of equilibrium, your aggregate demand is equals your aggregate supply, which is the same thing as your national income and the same thing as output. That means output declined. That's what it is. So how do you now stimulate? How do you now increase the aggregate demand so that people will understand? Aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is a component of three elements. Your consumption, your investment, and then, of course, government spending. G, government spending. Now, if you bring in the external sector, we call it X minus M. That is export minus import. Okay? When you bring all of those elements together, you are talking about aggregate demand, which is now called GDP. That when this aggregate demand shifts to the left, it means it is declining. That's what we are talking about. So how do you now increase demand? How do you increase output? Is output. So in a state of insecurity, for instance, you cannot go to your farm to produce. Factories are shutting down. You are the poverty capital of the world. Unemployment is very high. So there is no production. That is very simple. No production, and therefore your aggregate demand has shifted to the left. And if you are not in the liquidity trap, I will try to explain that if you are in the liquidity trap, that's a problem. But we are in the neoclassical region.
You know, you're taking us to class on this.
No, okay, what I'm trying to say is this. Okay. So what I'm saying is that there is decline in aggregate demand. So what do? You expand. That is called expansionary government policy. That means the G must be expanded. The question then is, what are you expanding this on? Government spending. Is it on recurrent expenditure, or you are expanding in productive?
Don't forget,
Yes.
Mr. Abolo,
Yes.
that this same government says we really don't have that money. So what are we expanding to or from?
But you're borrowing money. Where is the money that you are borrowing?
Are you suggesting that government should still go and borrow when we have a 33 trillion naira debt on our necks, according to the Senate?
I'm responding to your question. They say they don't have money, but they've been borrowing. They've been borrowing. Where's the money?
Well,
that money you are borrowing ought to be invested in, that is productive investment, capital spending, not on recurrent.
You know, part of the responses of this government has been the ESP, the Economic Sustainability Plan, which is meant to transition from the ERGP, which largely the projection of the ERGP, I mean, the government failed to reach those projections, let's just put it clearly. So the ESP came 2.3 trillion naira, and they detailed how it was going to be spent to stimulate the economy and the different projections. So in terms of responses, which is where I began the question referring to the NPR, now the ESP, looking at those responses, would you say they are enough to get us out of this recession as quick as possible?
You see, the issue is this. ESP, we do not lack plans in this country. We do not lack plans. ESP, SSP, and so on. Those plans are based on certain assumptions. Assumption, that's what they are based on. They are not based on improbables. Just like the NSAS, just like the global pandemic, they are based on simplistic assumptions. And therefore, when you have a discontinuity, when you have extreme events that occur, don't forget, it does not mean that because global pandemic is going, another one will come tomorrow. That is the world we live in. We are not talking about yellow fever. The next you are going to see we are not praying for other answers, but there are always improbables. Therefore, when you are preparing a plan, it must not be based just on simplistic assumptions. You must base it on stressed factors. Stress factors. Either you are going to use what is called historical scenarios or hypothetical scenarios. That's stress testing. So your plans, if they are not based on stress factors, within weeks or 2 weeks, that plan becomes nothing. That's what is happening.
So you don't see a success of this plan or any relief coming from these plans that government already has, especially this ESP?
Let me make this point.
Just before you do that, let's take a break. That's a very important one, though, but let's take a break to take a few messages and we'll be right back to this. Well, thanks for staying with us. So, Mr. Abolo, you want to answer that question? You don't think that the ESP is significant, even with 2.3 trillion naira, if even 2.3 trillion naira was released within 12 months as government planned?
Yes, let me first of all commend the government for coming up with a plan. At least even a bad plan is better than no plan at all. I have read that document. It contains a lot of good initiatives that can actually take us out of the woods. So I commend the government for that. But in strategy crafting, in strategy generally, there's what we call the 80-20% rule. 80-20% rule. 20% goes to the planning itself, the plan. 80% is for execution. So you have a lot of nice things in the document. But based on my experience over time, we find that execution is always not up more than 10%. So the document itself cannot take us anywhere without, diligent execution of the plan. It's very simple. So if there is a good monitoring mechanism and a framework to monitor the implementation of this plan, I think there is hope in the horizon.
As you have read the document, you also recognize that each of the various indices, each of the various segments have executing agencies and have coordinating ministries, departments, and or agencies in them. And then I want to believe that the economic team that the government put together under the vice president at the time for the recovery from COVID-19.
Naira to have a laboratory established, and all they could get in 2020 budget was 20 million naira out of $1 billion naira, and they gave some other examples. So regarding the question about whether this budget, the appropriation bill, will get us out of a recession, what do you have to say about it?
Well, first of all, let me say that I received that invitation. It was we had a prior scheduled engagement to be with the Minister of Transportation. We had a scheduled monitoring and evaluation trip on the Lagos-Ibadan rail, and that's where into. And I thought that it was sufficient for my director to address those issues. The budget office is not the DG budget, but the committee thought otherwise, and we're rescheduling the meeting, and we will address those issues. But let me make the point that the budget office doesn't make locations to specific projects. The budget office, looks at the resources available, and based on extant government priorities, breaks it up into what we call spending ceilings, and allocates to ministries, departments, and agencies. And those the MDAs then choose the projects and programs that will best achieve their sectoral goals. So if the point is being made about the adequacy of the entire budget, I've always been the first to admit that our size of our public expenditure is too low. Our budget is far smaller than it ought to be. We have about the lowest public expenditure ratio on the continent, and that's also positively correlated to our having the lowest tax to GDP ratio on the continent as well. Now the revenues government and so we've been running a deficit budget, but there's a limit to how much that you can borrow. So should the budget be 13 trillion naira? Absolutely not. It should be, possibly even as high as 3 times that. Can it be in our current circumstances? Not really.
All right,
so within the limited resources, we've got to pick and choose where this thing. In the same Ministry of Science and Technology that I wish the committee, for instance, have vetted its fine to the fact that we have far too many agencies there, and the budget is splintered into all of those.
Mr. Kabweze, there are so many.
Therefore, they end up not having enough individually.
So many issues that you have raised, and all of you gentlemen have raised on this program today. Well, the conversation most certainly has begun, and it definitely cannot end here. But we have to thank you so much for your time, Mr. Bernard Kabweze, DG, Budget Office of the Federation. Thank you so much for your time. Mr. Bukar Kyari is former chairman NESG, and he's also an economist, as well as Dr. Emmanuel Abolo, economic researcher and risk management professional, and DG of the Economic Think Tank Center Limited. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Well, there is more where that came from after this break. Stay with us.
In the 2020 finance bill to have a government, in quote, manage unclaimed dividends, which at this point is inching towards 200 billion naira. That naturally got a lot of reactions from Nigerians. So this morning, we're taking a closer look at that proposal, because on one hand, the government is saying, well, clearly there's a need to get revenue, get funds from anywhere we could get it, as far as is in the confines of the law. So there's a law angle, and that's also another angle we're looking at it, the exigency angle, which is the fact that there's a need for that. So how do we go about this? Well, two gentlemen join us this morning. Mr. Bode Ayeku is the President, Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators of Nigeria. He joins us from our Lagos studio, as well as Mr. GT Ogunye, who is a legal practitioner, also joining us from our Lagos studios. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us on the program.
Good
Well-
morning, viewers.
Great to have you. Mr. Ayeku, let me begin with you. On one hand, I know that a lot of people have reacted to this, but let me get your reactions. I mean, the legality, the exigency angle. What do you think of this proposal?
Very simple. The proposal is very strange. It is an infringement of the rights of shareholders. If you look at Principle 23 of the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance 2018, it states clearly that their particular provision is all about the protection of the rights of shareholders. And the only reason why shareholders buy shares in any company is basically to earn dividend. So if a third party is now trying to expropriate what belongs to shareholders, that definitely is contrary to the rights of shareholders. Apart from the provisions of the Code of Corporate Governance, it's also contrary to the provision of the Constitution. The Constitution provides and gives every individual the right to property. So when government is now saying that they will expropriate what belongs to individuals, that is the shareholders, that is contrary to the rights of every shareholder in Nigeria, which is guaranteed by the Constitution. And that is why it is of concern to us at the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators of Nigeria.
Okay, well, Mr. Oguye, there's a legal angle to this. So the federal government is going through this, or going about this through a law, the finance bill, basically saying that, well, if there's a law backing this, what stops us from pursuing it?
Well, first and foremost, let me say that our country is going through rough economic times, and everybody appreciates this. And so government is scrambling, looking for ways and means to keep ends meet, resorting to perpetual borrowing from far-flung places in the world, although the world is now a global village, resorting to domestic borrowing, external borrowing, etc., etc. Pension fund and all that. And now we have this proposal to fund the budget. Now, if Nigeria were to be in a state of war, although Nigeria is in a state of war with Boko Haram and all that, but if Nigeria were to be in a state of pervasive war, government could resort to extraordinary measures in a state of emergency to do certain things. For example, for a war effort, government could have requisition of the citizenry. People could be made to give up their houses to be used for barracks, vehicles to be used to convey troops and all that and all that. But that's not the situation here. So companies have shares, and people buy these shares in the capital market system, and these shares are to, attract dividends. There's a procedure and process for the payment of dividends. And so if dividends are unclaimed, I think that government should be supremely interested in how these dividends will be claimed, because that's the justice of the matter. There are many reasons why dividends are unclaimed. There could be share value depreciation, and people just feel, oh, what am I going to gain from that? There could be debts, there could be identification of shareholders, problems, etc., and all that. Government should be interested from the point of view of justice delivery to ensure that shareholders ultimately are giving justice. Not for government to feel that, right, if we can't identify these people, and companies may eventually be using this money, why can't we take the money off those companies so that we can use the money ourselves? That's expropriatory. And
but-
that's against the provisions.
But is government saying
of the
we're taking the
Constitution.
money off? I mean, it sounds as though the government is saying, well, we're managing this money for the shareholders or those who haven't claimed their dividends, and eventually it will be plowed back. So is this like government taking it?
Government is taking plow back to whom? If somebody, for example, has 5,000 value of share, 10,000, and we have the agglomeration of it in totality. This money now amounts to up to is hitting 200 billion, and so government takes this money. The Office of the Accountant General of the Federation and all the other bureaucrats will now manage this money in the so-called trust fund to use this money to fund government needs and all that. So if eventually those solitary shareholders want to take this money back, can you imagine the red tape and the bureaucratic stone wall that will be constructed against these individuals? Who will have to travel to Abuja, for example, to go and access these 5,000, 10,000 worth of shares? My take is that the regime that's in place could be built on, and that regime is, using multiple resources, the ICT resource, to identify shareholders and then ensure that ultimately they get these resources. There are records. There may be a number of reasons why people have not come up to take their shares. There are speculations that, during the first era of the indigenization decree, 1972, 1977, there were people who were being divested, foreigners, who were using cooks, gardeners as shareholders, just to ensure that they comply with the law. And that thereafter, they are also, during the privatization exercise, a lot of people who are also doing that. If that was truly the case, government could approach that from the angle or mechanism of enforcing the law. Meaning that if those steps were actually taken, that would mean that there was an infraction somewhere, that you had an illicit process. So you could identify those via the investigation, and your justice delivery system could then target those specific shares and then approach the court and say, forfeit these shares to the federal government in a normal way that you will enforce economic and financial crimes. But to then say, this category of shares, these dividends are not being claimed, so we're going to use it because we have an exigency or an emergency. It doesn't make good economic sense to me, and it doesn't make good justice sense to me. I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, that's obvious, but I'm saying that it doesn't meet the justice of the matter. You have to look generally, and our anchor. Because we don't treat the living very well in this country, sometimes we think that the dead or the presumed dead do not deserve justice. Some of these people who bought shares in their names were late and therefore cannot present themselves to claim dividends. I give you another example. Even the banking system, people die, they have, a little amount in their account, 100,000 could be salary account, 200,000, and they didn't plan to die. They didn't know that they were going to die. And when they want to access that money from the banks, they are then told to go and obtain a letter of administration. To obtain a letter of administration in Lagos, for example, the cost may well exceed the amount. And people then abandon those accounts.
Which also leads me to the issue of dormant accounts, because that's also, it's like in the mix, unclaimed dividends as well as dormant accounts. Mr. Ayeko, as of 2013, the value of dormant accounts was put in the region of 1 trillion naira. And our 2018 report says it had increased by 28%. And they are still there. What should happen? Because right now, it would seem like the dormant accounts, as you heard Mr. Ogunye said, some of the account owners are late, some can never be claimed again. what should happen? I mean, what would you then fault government's position if these things, remain unclaimed and unused?
Let's go back to the unclaimed dividend, because that is the focus of the finance bill before I answer that of the banks. What makes it absolutely unfair in terms of the intention of the government regarding the expropriation, the planned expropriation of unclaimed dividend, is that this particular profit we are talking about, the government has collected 30% as corporate tax. In addition to that, they've collected 2% as education tax. In addition to that also, they've collected 10% withholding tax on this profit. So, in total, government has collected 42% of the profit that is available for declaration as dividend. Now, government is saying the remaining 58%, we also should have interest in it. And the question is this: do they have any investment in these shares? No. From what they do not have any investment, they've collected 42%. That is unfair. Yes, we know we have problems with unclaimed dividend in Nigeria. Why we are surprised as an institute is that if you go through the provision of the Finance Bill 2020, there is no mention of any attempt or any plan by the government on how to address the problem. And the expectation is that when there is a problem, you look for solution. For example, you do not expect a father of a child that has been diagnosed to be having yellow fever to be looking for grave diggers. What they should be looking for is the solution. What are the reasons why people are not claiming their dividends? And there is this wrong impression out there that the unclaimed dividends are abandoned funds or they are ownerless. That is not true. The majority of those who have interest in this unclaimed dividend are alive, or those who are dead, their dependents are alive. But the system is so chaotic, so exploitative, unfair, and it is being handled in such a way that people are just frustrated. For example, Mr. Gunye mentioned something about the probate. And you can do a research. Visit any of the probate registry in any state of the federation. You will discover that not less than 60% of the applications we have there, they also include shares of deceased. So if you aggregate all the applications for letters of administration probate in all the probate registries in Nigeria, you will discover that substantial number of those applications are to enable them have access to the unclaimed dividends of these people. But if you go there, it's so bureaucratic in the sense that they ask, for example, since you need to process the application once, it will include the shares, it will include the property. Now, almost all the states, what they adopt is that you have to pay, whoever is processing, we need to pay 10% of the value of the assets to the government. For example, you talk about the value of property that is included. Here is a shareholder who has died suddenly, who did not expect that he would die, and then you are asking the dependents, even for them to continue to use the house that the dependent left behind, the deceased left behind, that they need to pay 10% to the government. They cannot afford it. And in the process, the government now comes up with very arbitrary valuation procedure, in which case they look at the property and they say it's worth 1 million naira. The question is this: are the dependents selling this property? They are not selling it, just a change of name, but the government has made it so complex. And when, if you look at some states, they also have maybe assumed value of property in certain locations. Now, the question is this: if you ask the government to pay for this particular assumed valuation, would they be able to pay? And in the process, there is compromise, there is corruption in the system, and because of that, a lot of people will abandon their claim.
This will seem a lot like, Mr. Ayeko, that there is a lot of legal jungles, so to speak, for people to navigate. So, Mr. Ogunye, what are the options for the people who are directly concerned with these unclaimed dividends and dormant accounts?
Well, first, my co-panelist, he's spoken elaborately and very intelligently about this topic, and is very knowledgeable about some of the problems that we face on the legal front. There will be the need to have reforms to ease the process of succession in certain aspects, because succession problem is part of the problem that we're dealing with. Your parents have shares. You can't access the shares unless you get a letter of administration or there's a will that has been admitted to probate, and that process is cumbersome. That process is not easy at all. And so the certain time people just feel that, yes, our parents that had these shares. What's even the value of these shares anyway? And so
looking at just a moment,
reforms.
Yes, you're talking about those reforms. Would you say, because some from listening to you right now, some would imagine maybe it was deliberate, or was there a reason that bureaucracy was created to make it difficult so that it doesn't go into the wrong hands?
No, I wouldn't say that it's deliberate. Law can become archaic. Law can become difficult to implement. It is the responsibility of legislators and those in the executive branch of government and the citizens at large to reinvent laws. That's why we talked about legal reforms. That's why we have a statutory body called Law Reform Commission. Okay? So if these processes are this cumbersome and they're causing pain to people, it is a binding duty of the society to look at it and say that, what are we going to do about this? For example, I've given the instance of people leaving their accounts of their spouses or their parents in the banks. 100,000, 200,000. Well, they said that this problem is even more than the value of the money. So they leave it there. And so the agglomeration approximates the 1 trillion or whatever that you are talking about just now. So you need that reform. And at the level of the government, sticking to the issue of unclaimed dividends, the companies whose shares were purchased by shareholders in the first instance, who are opposed to this, the institutions, capital market operators and all that, they also have a responsibility to discharge here. And that responsibility is to come together, synergize, and help resolve this problem. It's not enough to say that we have such instances elsewhere. In England, we have over 3 billion pounds. So in Australia, we have over 1 billion Australian dollars, and so on and so forth. So the situation must be the same in Nigeria. No. And I think that steps from the reports that we have are being taken in this direction. Okay. Government has a role, therefore, to help them achieve that objective rather than clamping down and then ceasing.
So eventually they need to work together.
Yeah.
But this is what we'll do. We'll go on a quick break. And when we return, we'll take your closing thoughts on this, especially what's happening to those dividends now that they remain unclaimed. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Unclaimed dividends, dormant accounts. What should be done to them, or with them in this case? But just to mention that we did reach out to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the head of communications, to weigh in on this matter. And we're still expecting a response. But let me go back to Mr. Yeku, the President, Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators of Nigeria. So the question now is, those dividends remain unclaimed. Those accounts remain dormant. What is happening to them, or what has been happening to them all this while that they remain dormant or unclaimed? That's a big question a lot of people are asking also.
The current practice is very simple and is working. What happens is that when a company declares dividend, after 15 months, if they still remain unclaimed, those money, 90% of the money will be returned by the registrars to the companies to hold, while the registrar will use the remaining 10% to service the ones that are being claimed from time to time. Now, after 12 years, those unclaimed dividends will then be written back to the books of the company to be plowed back into the operations of the business so as to expand the business and then to generate further profit, which will be distributed. And the companies have been working with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the registrars, to identify those people who owns this unclaimed dividend to ensure that they get this unclaimed dividend. And we have also been sensitized, for example, the Institute, we've been sensitizing the government on the need for us to actually work, for the government to work with the various probate registry. That is the major bottleneck we have in this country. If they are able to simplify the process in such a way that when a person dies, you are not asking the person to bring 10% of the net worth of the deceased, it will be easier for them to access get the letters of administration or the probate, and then they will be able to claim this dividend. We've recommended to SEC and also to the authorities, let them simplify the process of claiming unclaimed the dividends. As at now, what happens is that if you have unclaimed dividends in 5 companies, you need to fill 5 different forms. And we have said no. just allow the shareholders to fill one form, list out all the companies where they have this unclaimed dividend, and then the registrars of this company will process and then will pay. And there must be a time frame within which this should be done. It's not something that should be you should just be hanging indefinitely. In addition to that, we also identify another segment of people who fall within this category. You know, during the banking consolidation, a lot of people bought shares. Most of those companies, for example, most of those banks, around 2011, you recall we have about 100 banks. Today, we have about 20-something banks. Most of those banks, they have disappeared. And the shareholders assume that, okay, those banks have disappeared, we do not have unclaimed dividend again. What the government needs to do is to do something like a corporate mapping, whereby the remaining 20-something banks that are still in existence, let us know the banks they have acquired, so that the shareholder will say, okay, yes, I bought shares in 2012. That company, that bank is no longer in existence, it has been liquidated. That bank has now been absorbed by so bank, so that they know the banks to follow up this with, and then they will be in a position to claim this dividend. Apart from that, going forward, because we are just looking at the immediate problem that we are having about 200 billion. That is nothing. The major problem is, how do we manage this proactively? The best way to do that, which the institute has suggested to the government, is that in the application, the share applications forms we are designing going forward, there should be a provision for a default beneficiary to be provided by the applicant, the shareholder, so that he says that in case of death or whatever, if I have a problem with my account, my dividend should be paid automatically to a beneficiary, a named beneficiary, something close to like a will. Yeah. So that if the person dies, there is no need for a probate. The money will be paid automatically.
Yeah, very quick one, Mr. Ayeku. You heard Mr. Ogunye say that the other time that we need to dust up the laws that govern these segment of our life that you're talking about. Has there been any proposition to the National Assembly about this, to ensure that, at least to make this proposition, that this should be done so that things can be tied up better?
We have been doing that because we have identified this issue of probate and letters of administration as a major problem.
What has been the response?
We have not seen any response that is tangible, because I have not seen anything as at now, and that is why we are concerned. Now, regarding the current issue we are having, the major problem we need to focus on is the effect on the capital market. If there is a mistake to allow this Finance Bill 2020 to be passed with this proposal to expropriate unclaimed dividend, a lot of listed companies will delist. Because the question is this, and if you look at the recent trend, when the big companies, when they delist, they will not delist and fall back to public companies, they go straight to private company. In such a way, and immediately that happens, they remove their registrars. Okay. So there will be loss of jobs. Apart from that, you know, in the ecosystem, the capital market ecosystem, there are a lot of stakeholders, including the government. For example, whenever there is a trading on the shares of any listed company in Nigeria, the government gets VAT, the government gets stamp duty, the stockbrokers...
So many issues, Mr. Ayeku, because, I mean, you're talking about the finance bill now, then there's still KAMA still coming up and all of that, but then, but we really have to close out in a bit. Mr. Ogunye, what's the legal solution for any human, any individual or corporate organization caught in this web?
Well, what I think should be done is what I had proposed earlier, and that proposal has been there. The stakeholders, including the government, must work together to ensure that there is a solution to this problem. Look, it can be argued, for example, that from the angle of the companies that sell these shares to people who own these unclaimed shares, that if there's a realization that ultimately after 12 years, the money will be plowed back to the company for the company to be using, that itself is a disincentive for such company to be proactive in ensuring that these dividends are paid as a when due. I'm suggesting that all the stakeholders need to come together to find a solution to the problem.
All right.
Well, Mr. G.C. Ogunye, Mr. Bode Ayeku, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on this issue. We appreciate it.
Well, it's definitely not going away anytime soon. We'll keep our eyes there. But then just two quick messages before we go. George Okpango says, about budgeting, I wonder why we come out with different figures every year in terms of budget, but nothing whatsoever changes in the lives of ordinary citizens. The essence of yearly budgets is to improve the quality of lives for the citizens and not for lip services. I wonder how we will fund this 2021 budget, because it is very clear that our country is broke.
Well, that question was for you as part of the economic handlers. But this final one, agriculture remains our hope of economic development. It talks about 10% of our population supporting and investing in farming. Professor Enakina, thanks for that tweet.
Well, maybe Professor Enakina should have mentioned your name and ask, where's your farm?
No way.
Well, that's our program today. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day, and please keep safe. I'm Ayo Makinde.
And I'm Kayode Kikiolu. To have a great day.